SMU political science professor Matthew Wilson, thank you so much. Lots of political news to digest. So first, this breakthrough deal now between the House and the Senate, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and House Speaker Dave Phelan. This deal, how big of a deal is it that they finally came to an agreement?
Well, it is a big deal. It's a big deal substantively for Texas taxpayers in the sense that some meaningful property tax relief is now official and will be on the way, at least pending voters' approval of the constitutional amendment when it's on the ballot, which I think is a no-brainer. So substantively, it matters a lot. Politically, it's also essential for all the parties involved. The governor needed to get this done. The Senate needed to get this done. The House needed to get this done. The Republican infighting was starting to look unseemly, but now I think they have a major legislative accomplishment that they can talk about and something that I think will be very popular among voters.
Did it surprise you that this dispute between Republicans was so public, at times even not so nice, and that it went on for over a month?
It was a little surprising that they didn't hammer these differences out before the session started as opposed to afterwards. Everybody knew that property tax was going to be at the top of the agenda, property tax relief. And so you would have expected that there would have been substantial conversations before the session started about how they wanted to go about this. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter to voters. That is, the same tax relief will be coming on the same schedule as would have been true had they come to an agreement earlier. But everybody could have been saved a little bit of embarrassment in the public square had they gotten their act together earlier.
And Democrats put out their own version of a bill that call for renters to get a rebate. That is not in this bill. What do you make of the fact that Democrats came out with their own bill last week?
Well, the Democrat bill is really just political theater. They know it to be just political theater. Republicans control all the levers of power in Austin. So this was always essentially an internal debate among Republicans about how they were going to do this. But Democrats do want to put a marker down for their base. And a lot of the renters in the state are Democratic base voters. And I think this plan, even though they knew it had no chance of adoption, at least signals to their base that they are standing up for their economic interests.
Other news today, State Senator Roland Gutierrez, Democrat from San Antonio, announced he is getting into the Democratic primary to unseat Senator Ted Cruz. He joins about 2 months afterwards North Texas Congressman Colin Allred. And so I'm wondering what you make of him jumping into the race now.
It's an interesting addition to the race. I think Colin Allred is still a very well-funded and better-known figure. I think he would certainly be regarded as the favorite to capture the Democratic nomination. But of course, a critical swing constituency in Texas politics is the Latino vote. And Democrats in the state are very worried about the trend of Latino voters away from the Democratic Party towards Republicans. What Gutierrez may well say is, if this really concerns you, you ought to think about having a Latino candidate for this top office on the ballot. It'll be interesting to see whether he can rally voters within the Democratic primary on the basis of ethnic solidarity and use that to be a strong competitor to Colin Allred.
To your point, I mean, you know, the Congressman Allred raised $6.2 million in the 2 months that he's been in the race. Plus, he transferred almost $2.5 million that he had in his campaign account from running for Congress. So he's got $8.6 million. That's a lot of money to have at the beginning of a race. And so how could Senator Gutierrez beat Allred statewide? It's not easy running statewide, as you know.
It is difficult, and I think he will find it hard to raise money on the scale that Allred has. A lot of that money for Colin Allred has come in from people who just see him as not Ted Cruz, as being the alternative, the opponent to Ted Cruz, and so a lot of that is anti-Ted Cruz money. Those kinds of people are going to be reluctant to spend money that will create a more competitive, more divisive Democratic primary. So I think that's going to be an obstacle that Gutierrez will face in terms of fundraising. I think strategically, his real potential path to victory will be rising as a champion of the Latino vote, that he will want to position himself as the voice for Hispanic voters within the Democratic Party in the state of Texas. Because I think that Allred is going to have definitely a leg up with African Americans, and Allred also, I think, plays quite well among more liberal whites. And those are other important constituencies within the Democratic primary. So I think Gutierrez will have to rely heavily on the Hispanic vote to make a competitive race.
Is there a difference maker in this race as far as the Democratic primary is concerned? You talked about the different constituencies. Is there an issue that you feel that could be a difference maker or anything else?
Well, it'll be interesting to see whether Gutierrez tries to run to Allred's left. Allred tried to position himself in Washington as a sort of a common sense center-left guy, not an ideological firebrand. If there is ideological space in the Democratic primary, it might be for someone to be the more leftist, more progressive alternative to Colin Allred. We'll see if Gutierrez tries to occupy that space, if he tries to position himself there. But that remains to be seen whether that's the tack he chooses to take.
And then I wanted to ask you about a general election race between Cruz and either Democrat who's going to win. And perhaps when I spoke with State Representative Carl Sherman of DeSoto, he says he's, considering entering this race. But what is a Democrat going to have to do to win statewide for the first time in 30 years?
Well, I think it's going to be a really uphill battle for whichever Democrat captures the nomination. Texas still remains a state that leans Republican. Ted Cruz will have all the advantages of incumbency. President Joe Biden is relatively unpopular, presumably will continue to be relatively unpopular in 2024. And Democrats nationally have a whole slew of Senate races where they have to be on defense, which limits their ability to really invest in playing offense in a state like Texas. So there are a lot of advantages that Cruz will bring into his reelection bid. That said, for an incumbent, Cruz is not an especially popular politician. He tends to be somewhat polarizing and divisive. So whoever the Democratic nominee is will have at least a puncher's chance. But the cautionary thing to keep in mind is that Beto O'Rourke, last time around, with all of his money, with all of his celebrity power, with all of the Betomania, still fell short and lost to Ted Cruz in 2018, which was a year that was much more Democratic nationally than 2024 is likely to be. So whoever the Democratic nominee is will have a chance, but he will definitely enter the race as the underdog.
I also wanted to ask you about the situation going on with the impeachment of Ken Paxton, the suspended attorney general in Texas. He obviously faces a trial September 5th. And now there is a new website out there that is trying to defend Paxton. And at the same time, it lists the names and gives the phone numbers for all the state senators, the Republican state senators, Democratic state senators, and it's encouraging Paxton supporters to call them and put pressure on them to acquit Paxton. What do you make of this?
Well, I think it shows that Paxton's allies believe that he has a stronger political hand than he does legal hand, and that they would like to see this process play out as a contest of political strength and political power rather than as a more strictly legal process. The old adage among attorneys is, if you have the facts, pound the facts. If you don't have the facts, pound the law. If you don't have the law or the facts, pound the table. And that seems to be a lot of what's going on here. That most of that website is a series of attacks on those who have criticized Paxton rather than an actual refutation of the charges against him. And I think that's going to be the critical thing. If Paxton is going to make any headway in fighting these charges, at some point he's going to have to offer a specific, credible refutation to the charges against him. And that's what we've heard very little of so far. Instead, most of the pro-Paxton energy has been in attacking those who have criticized Paxton or in claiming procedural violations rather than in addressing the substance of the accusations against him.
But this is a reminder that this is still a very political, this whole impeachment trial is very political. It's not legal. although the ramifications are if he is convicted by the Texas Senate, he loses his job, he's out. But this is still very political. And so I'm wondering, what do you make of the pressure that's on these Republicans sitting in the Senate?
It's important to remember that any impeachment proceeding is always a hybrid of a political and a legal process. The jurors ultimately here are elected officials. They're people who are, at the end of the day, responsible to their constituents. So therefore, they can be pressured. Now, what remains to be seen is how intense the Republican base commitment to Ken Paxton is. Would Republican base voters really be angry if a Republican senator voted to remove Ken Paxton from office? I think that's very much up in the air right now. And of course, that is the question that this campaign is trying to step into. They want to generate anger among Republican voters if Ken Paxton is removed from office. They want to create more interest and more groundswell of grassroots GOP support on behalf of Ken Paxton. So I think that is the political space this is wading into.
One other quick question, and there is a billboard campaign now that is out there. I've seen it on for one state representative, and it basically it basically calls them out for voting for impeachment. What do you make of that, and what could the potential impact be there? I would imagine that representative could face a primary challenge.
That would be where I think we would see political hay potentially made from this. There might be some Republicans who jump into primary challenges against sitting state legislators, trying to position themselves to the right of the incumbents by saying, look, this person voted with the Democrats and with the quote unquote rhinos against Ken Paxton. It remains to be seen how much traction those kinds of appeals will get, but certainly some people are at least thinking they may be able to make some political hay in primaries by going against Republicans who end up voting against Ken Paxton.
Matthew Wilson, SMU political science professor, thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it as always.
All right, thanks for having me.